You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you here on the show. It is Sunday, November 24th. We can no longer say Indiana is undefeated. We can still say Indiana has 10 wins, 10-1 on the season, coming off what was certainly a difficult day at the office in Columbus, Ohio. We're going to talk extensively about that. We're also going to talk about college football playoff and all the items that kind of fell out from what happened over the course of the last 24 hours, as it was a very busy time in college football. And Indiana still right in the thick of things, despite the results that happened over in Columbus. I was there. I've got some reflections and things like that I'm going to share with everybody. And Scott, you got a chance to watch the game on TV.
I did.
So we'll talk about that as well. Scott, first of all, how you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's a bummer. I think we're all a little bit sad, but I would say this, take a moment, have some reflection. We're still in a Scott fever dream. Like 2 or 3 months ago, if I said 10-1 with a loss to Ohio State, that wasn't an awesome game. You should be like, take it, done. Like I will bank that all day long. So just keep that in mind. We're still in positive fever dream territory.
Yes, exactly. And it's one of those things where the sting of what occurs during a game like that, it's just one of those wild things. And you got to kind of shake it off and put yourself in a position where you think a little more clearly. And so we're going to try to do that on the show today, and we'll work through it together. Those of you that are watching live, we are going live here 4:00 on YouTube. Thanks for joining us. And for those of you who are listening afterwards, we'll probably go live next week. So if you want to join next week live on Sunday after the Bucket game, we'll be there for that as well. But anyway, before we get started, let's just remind you folks that we are part of the Back Home Network, a full constellation of shows, including, of course, our friends over at Assembly Call, the Doing the Work podcast, just a variety of different shows, and all brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabric, the coolest designs. And again, we saw a ton of Homefield, both enemy and friend, in Ohio Stadium and around Ohio Stadium. It was really one of those cool things. Again, I talk about this every week, just seeing all of the different types of gear that Homefield has produced over the years. And you know, it's almost like you can find different vintages, like a good wine, look, here's a 92 Bordeaux, or, here's a 21 Chianti, and it's like, oh, there's a 17 oatmeal hoodie, and there's a 23 pullover. There's just a lot of that stuff. We saw Stanford Steve on College Game Day yesterday wearing that awesome looking Tulane baseball pullover, and of course a ton of people wearing various IU gear. You can outfit yourself in Natalie attired style as well through Homefield. Head over to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. And just a reminder, folks, that you should be following Homefield on their socials. They just launched their Black Friday Cyber Monday sale. So if you're looking to stock up, don't use the Home23 code. Use the code that Homefield texted you if you were on their text thread. And you can get, I think, up to 30% off some of the things at the store. Or you can just get them straight away. I don't think you need a code for that because it's the Black Friday Cyber Monday sale. So great time to stock up on Homefield right now. Head to homefieldapparel.com, your place to go for the finest in college fashion. Also, just a reminder, we're on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. You can get our podcasts and videos delivered free to your inbox. And of course, if you'd like to financially support the podcast, you can do that through Substack as well. $5 a month, $50 a year. Always helps us as we keep the lights on here and feed the producers who occasionally do things for us as well. It's important stuff. Anyway, Substack, go sign up. Be one of the over 1,000 subscribers now that joins us on Substack on a daily basis. All right, Scott, let's dive into it. Indiana loses to the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it was not a particularly close game, at least in the second half. The Hoosiers started off strong, led at the end of the first quarter, stopped Ohio State on the first drive of the game, drove all the way down the field themselves and scored, and really looked like they were going to make a game effort of this. And even as they struggled through most of the first half to capitalize on that, it looked like they were going to be able to keep it in. At halftime, it was a 14-7 game, which, as I tweeted, and it's eerily similar to what you just said about the fever dream. It's like, hey, if you'd said we were going to be down a score, getting the ball to start the second half at Ohio Stadium, you'd have taken it. And unfortunately, Indiana did almost nothing the rest of the game, while Ohio State really came into their own, flexed their muscles pretty considerably. They end up winning 38-15. I am curious what it looked like through the television first. So I'm going to let you start with your overall observations on what you saw in this contest.
They're very specific to me. And if you listen to any of our previews or Crimson Cash, you knew what I was dealing with, that I had a basketball, my son's basketball game at 1:00. So for me, I watched the first part of the game. I watched us score a touchdown, was very fired up on my phone, watched us do the goal line stand. And then that's when I had to go coach my basketball game. So went and coached the basketball game. I was about to get out of the gym until one of the parents was like, oh, like Scott, like, we got it, man. Not bad. And it sounded like he said, hey, 17-14. I was like, yeah. Like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. But I come back thinking 17-14. And then I see Ohio State score that, go up to 7-7, and then it's 14-7. I'm thinking, all right, well, no matter what, at least we're scoring a touchdown, or didn't realize, I think he said 7-14, because obviously the score was never 17-14.
Right.
And it's just one of those where I was like, I was pissed that I got the score given away, and then I was more pissed when I had this like false sense of, anyway, the first part of the game, Indiana looked like the dominant team. It was wild. I mean, they were pushing around both sides of the line, this methodically scored, stopped Ohio State, and then a couple of mistakes, just a couple little mistakes. And it's not that the team got broke. I think it was just a bit of almost like the veneer of, oh yeah, this is Indiana and we're Ohio State, and we're just going to take control for a little bit. And they did. So I mean, that, and then, I know you're going to talk about the atmosphere there. The broadcast was just really tough to watch because, on Indiana's first drive, both the pass interference calls were obvious pass interference calls. And, Joel Klatt's like, well, man, I guess they're going to be calling this game tight. It's like, well, that's not a tight call. Like, when you're grabbing the jersey and you have your arms wrapped around the receiver, that's just a pass interference, whether you're calling it tight or not. And then it just became an Ohio State love fest. A little bit of eating crow for what, the brashness of Indiana and Cignetti. Although it does kind of come with this feeling of like, how dare Indiana think they can have the hubris to compete with the Ohio State Buckeyes, which is a little bit odd, because it's like Penn State and Michigan are allowed to think they can win. But it's tough. But I would say this, the last thought on the game is, what I'm really trying to do, and I think we all need to parse. We'll talk about the college football playoff. Like, there's two things here. This affects our college football playoff ability, but it's if you take that out, like, that's not anything any of us thought about this season. Just a game against Ohio State, how it fits into the season. It's not abnormal, and it wasn't awful.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as I think about the game and the way that it unfolded, a couple of things stuck out to me as I've tried to reflect on it. First of all, Indiana, I think, got a little too comfortable with their success on the first drive of the game. And I actually think to some degree, this reminded me of like a military action where the opposition allows the army they're fighting against to like gain ground and feel like they're gaining the advantage and that they can do certain things. And then, because if you look at that first drive that Indiana had, I mean, it was really an amazing drive. 11 plays, 70 yards, super methodical. And I remember sitting there watching that, and we got all the way basically to the end of the first quarter. And I'm like, wow, if Indiana's able to do that consistently, they may just choke this game out. And then almost immediately after the turnover on downs that Indiana forced at the goal line, Ohio State changed the way that they were playing the game defensively and got hyper aggressive with their blitzes. And Indiana looked like they got sucker punched at that point. Like, they looked completely dumbfounded at the amount of pressure they were getting. They were unsure where the pressure was coming from, and they didn't have an adjustment. They didn't change what they were doing essentially for almost the whole game. And I think that is a learning lesson for Indiana's coaching staff and players, in that Ohio State realized it was a 60-minute game. And I can remember standing there in the stands thinking to myself, we got a long way to go. Like, this is a great start, but there's a long way to go in this. And I was wondering what Ohio State's change was going to be. And when Ohio State realized that they could bring an extra blitzer pretty regularly and overwhelm Indiana with their speed and with their angles, and Indiana wasn't going to really change what they were doing, it was kind of game over. And you were just like, well, can Indiana white-knuckle this thing to where maybe they can keep it within a couple of scores and hopefully find a place to adjust down the stretch? And they never could. And it's unfortunate because, I think you think about the way the defense played. If you take away the last touchdown, which was really a product of the onside kick, and I think the fact that the game was essentially over, the defense essentially only allowed 17 points to be scored in this game. Even if you throw in the last touchdown that they did let in, it's 24 points. I mean, letting up 24 points at the Horseshoe normally is going to be enough of an effort.
That you second most yards, like Ohio State's been held to all year or something.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it ended up being a pretty good defensive performance, all things considered. But the problem was, Ohio State scored 38 points. 14 of the points that were allowed were mistakes that you just can't make in games like this. And yes, there were some penalties that were questionable. There were a couple of plays that they shouldn't have happened the way that they happened. But realistically speaking, what I think about with this Indiana team is like they put themselves in a position where they could have won the game if they'd figured out something offensively to adjust to. But then even if they had, they made so many little errors that are pretty uncharacteristic of this team that it put them in a position where I don't even think they could have won the game, even if they had things going well on offense, because Ohio State kept gaining momentum as a result of those things. So I come away overall thinking to myself, well, the score did to some degree, it was both representative of how dominant Ohio State was, but it was also unrepresentative because a lot of what Indiana did in the game on defense warranted a better result than what they got. But to me, the biggest take-home point, I think, from everything, even above and beyond the special teams errors, which we'll get to in a minute, is how unwell this offense looks against pressure, and the fact that over the course of the last 6 quarters of football, Indiana has scored 18 points, 3 in the second half against Michigan, 15 against Ohio State. That's not what got Indiana to where they are right now. And unless they can figure out a way to address what they faced in this Ohio State game and in the Michigan game, it really does put a hard ceiling on what they can accomplish moving forward. And it's frankly imperiled a little bit the certainty of them getting into the college football playoff. I still think, as we'll get to that later, I still think they will get in. But if you wanted to have questions about Indiana, they did very little to quell those questions, at least in terms of their offense in this game. And that is very disappointing.
No, and expanding off what you were just talking about, with the Michigan to this game, that's the only really concerning part, is that outside of, the first drive against Ohio State and, the first half against Michigan, you're seeing as the talent level of the other team steps up with Michigan and Ohio State, and the games kind of ratchet up with talent and importance. Thank God for our defense is really where we're at, which I don't think a lot of us would have said 2 or 3 games ago. If the defense doesn't hold on against Michigan, we don't win that game. And as we just said, if the defense doesn't kind of hold Ohio State a couple of times and early in the game, this would have been a really ugly blowout. You look at the, Curtis Rourke, 68 yards passing, just not what you expect. And that's the concerning part is this, like feature or bug kind of thing? Like, is this something where Cignetti and the staff just need to go back and tinker and figure out, how can we get this offense humming again against higher competition? Or is it just this offense has a ceiling and the ceiling is higher competition, and they're not going to be able to hum playing against those types of teams?
I mean, look, I think there's a couple of things. Ohio State is legitimately one of the most talented teams in the country.
Yeah.
And a lot, their talent, and Taylor Lehman, I was talking with earlier today about this, a lot of their talent emanates from their speed and their ability to close gaps very quickly. And that's what they did in the pass rush that caused so many problems for Curtis Rourke. they just absolutely terrorized Rourke. And they terrorized the offensive line and the running backs that were supposed to be into block. And I mean, you just go back and just look at some of the highlights of the attempts to block on the sacks and the hurries that occurred. They just could not get over in enough time to stop what Ohio State was trying to do. And I think there's some interesting things to take from all of that. I mean, Ohio State ended the game with 5 sacks and 8 tackles for loss. And this is where the dividing line between like the top 5 or 6 teams from a talent perspective in the country and the rest of the teams, that's where it really lies. It's like, do you have that type of NFL caliber speed and athletic ability? And if you don't, you got to have a way to undercut the effectiveness of that talent as it's going against you. And I think that was probably, for me, at least on the offensive side, the most disappointing thing. Where, Rourke was in so much trouble so often because he wasn't able to get the ball out to receivers quickly because the receivers weren't ready. There was very little short developing play in terms of the passing game. I didn't see screens. I didn't see little dump offs in the middle of the field over where the people were coming on the blitzes. And yes, Ohio State was doing a good job of disguising where those were coming from and where they were going. But every pass play felt like it took forever to develop. And this is, again, it's where I think Indiana kind of got suckered into doing that because they had that time because there weren't blitzes coming on the first offensive drive that they had.
Right.
And then
Rourke was making all of those throws across the middle in the 7-8 yard range.
Yeah. And then those were gone. Like those took too long to develop. And so that leads to, it's interesting because Indiana obviously looked terrible in terms of their offense. I think they ended up with 150 some yards, 153 total yards. They ended up with 85 rushing yards, but it's deceptive because Tyson Lawton, 15 carries, 79 yards, a 5.3 yards per carry average and 2 touchdowns. Justice Ellison, 17 carries, 62 yards, 3.6 yards per carry. That's not as good, but that's still pretty good. But Indiana only had 85 yards rushing because James Evans lost 23 yards on the punt drop, and Curtis Rourke lost 33 yards between the sacks and the fumble that he had and whatnot. And so that's the kind of thing that skews your perception of what Indiana was doing. Indiana probably should have really just focused on the run, should have used more draws, should have used a lot shorter passing plays. And that was very frustrating in the moment. Like, why weren't they making those adjustments? Why weren't they figuring out, like, how do we get the ball out of Rourke's hands as quickly as possible? They went away from the RPOs. They just didn't have any time, but they didn't do anything to give themselves time. And look, I have a hard time being overly critical. I think it's more of an observation than a criticism. Yes, I'm critical in that I think they should have made those adjustments or tried to. But as one of the folks in the chat pointed out, like the offensive line couldn't hear to communicate with each other. That was from Indy Nation. And, we heard that in the post game, like, Signetti saying that Kadick couldn't hear in there and they couldn't make changes in what they were doing. Well, and this goes back to what we talked about in our pregame podcast, like this is where the environment hurts you. If it's that loud that your offensive line can't hear and you don't have a way to adjust to that, it creates a lot of problems. And so I don't blame Indiana for not being able to manage that, given that they hadn't been in this situation before. The players, including the transfers, they'd never played in an environment like that before. They hadn't heard that kind of noise. And so, so now they have, and we know that hopefully they'll learn things from that and get better. But it was just a shame because I feel like they probably should have anticipated all of that a little bit more. When you saw what Michigan did in the second half against Indiana to make life so miserable for their passing game, you probably should have assumed that Jim Knowles was going to look at that and say, okay, we've actually got the ability to put more pressure on Rourke and more pressure on their offensive line. We're going to go out and do that. And so it's a lesson learned, I guess, but it's disappointing to learn it with that much of a deficit. And that's just kind of one of those things where you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, there's not a lot else you can say about it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would say, and we talked about this in the preview, we talked about it a couple times throughout the year. I think it's just, a feature of this offense it's been a fantastic offense, but it's not an offense that has explosive plays. So it's not an offense based on, 180 yard play or 170 yard play here. They're normally, longer drives. What I mean by that is that when you saw it against Michigan, you saw it against Ohio State, if one or two plays in a drive don't work, you're not having the first down play breaking for 60 yards. Suddenly you can get into second and long and third and 7 situations very quickly where suddenly the pressure builds up. And part of it is Ohio State being good, but in the second half, 1, 2, 3, four, the last drive doesn't really count, but 4 of the 6 drives were 3 and outs. And I just think, based on an offense that doesn't break a lot of 50, 60-yard pass or run plays, that's based on more 7 to 15-yard plays, if you do a running play in the first down run play, it's like second and 7, that's not bad. But then if the pass isn't there or you get a blitz, suddenly now it's third and 8 or third and 11. It's like just you feel like we were way more on our back foot, where a lot of times our offense throughout the year, it does feel like it's a little more front facing, front foot, even though it's not even those big plays, just because it's kind of keeping moving and moving and moving. But when you don't have those, suddenly you can get in these third down situations where it just did feel like they didn't have the answers based on the fact that the Ohio State, the way Ohio State was blitzing.
Yeah. And then, you compound the problem with the mistakes, and obviously the glaring mistakes, the two of them that took this from, what would have been a disappointing loss, but a close loss, and turned it into what it was. Taking the sacks aside, where of course the James Evans dropped punt snap that led immediately to a touchdown, and then of course the kick return or the punt return from Caleb Downs, the 79-yarder that led to the touchdown that really kind of broke the game completely. With those, the one thing we talked a lot about the weather. We talked about it being colder. We talked about wind. I was watching the forecast like a hawk. The one thing that really didn't look like was going to happen was it was going to get wet. Right. There was a minimal chance of precipitation. And again, I was watching this for 4 days, every 6 hours to 12 hours. I was looking at the forecast. I was out tailgating before the game. I got to the tailgate spot on top of the parking garage across the street from the stadium at 7:00 in the morning. It was windy, but there was no rain. I was out walking around the stadium at 10:30, 10:45, about an hour and a half before kick. There was no rain. I sat down in my seat. I was there for basically the entire hour leading in. There was no rain. And then I want to say it was right towards the end of Indiana's long touchdown drive, you started to get a little bit of a mist, and that mist continued to grow. And it got to the point that by the middle of the second quarter, I think I tweeted this, like it was almost like that borderline between mist and rain. Like it wasn't steadily raining, but there was so much wetness in the atmosphere and it was coming down on you that it was essentially like rain. And James Evans, who's been a dynamite punter for Indiana, just fundamentally made a mistake in that he didn't hang on to his towel long enough, didn't wear gloves, and couldn't hang on to the ball when it was snapped to him. And I actually also think to some degree that the wetness that was out there started to affect Indiana's footing on the offensive line and their confidence in their ability to plant and move and do the things that they did. And Ohio State had a big advantage there because Ohio State, because they were sending fast, angry, athletic people, they were able to do it straight downhill oftentimes. And Indiana, having to move and having to try to get in the way, couldn't adjust. That's just one of those divine intervention things. Like it didn't rain in the second half, so you can't say that was the excuse for the whole game. But in that critical period of time in the second quarter, when it got really wet, it got wet at like the exact wrong time for Indiana, and it led directly to the mistakes that they made. And it's just unfortunate because it's like, it's one of those what ifs. Like if it doesn't happen, because the wind ended up not being that big of a factor, but if that doesn't happen, Evans probably doesn't drop the punt. A bunch of other things don't happen. Maybe there's a couple of fewer sacks. Maybe you're looking at a different game in the second half. I still think Ohio State wins. I still think Ohio State was the superior physical team. They were the better coached team. They were the team that looked like they had been there before, and they looked like the team that had a point to prove. But, it took, again, a game that could have been like 21-15 or 27-15 and made it 38-15. And that's the breaks. That's how it goes. And certainly the statistics show Ohio State won the game overall, but it is kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, so I'm not going to belabor that point. The thing that I would say about the mistakes are this, that, and I don't want to sound like I'm just, carrying water for the coaching staff or just being overly optimistic, but, in years past, you and I would get really frustrated with this stuff because there were mistakes every week. And a lot of time it would cause losses. that there would be a mistake here, a mistake there. It's like, God, if it wasn't holding penalties, it was, mistakes on offense or mistakes on the special teams. This season has been basically hallmarked by not a lot of mistakes and not a lot of penalties and very crisp playing and executing at a high level. And so it's not awesome, but I would say, for James Evans, like, dude, you made a mistake. Like you had a bad play. Everyone can do that on a season where there haven't been a lot of mistakes or games where we're, seeing mistakes causing issues. I hate to kind of be so blasé about it, but just, hey, it's the breaks. Like it happens. They're college kids. People are going to make mistakes. The really positive way to look at it is, again, we'll talk more about the college football playoff, but this probably puts us in a spot where we're looking to go to a road game, not host a game. It's like you've now been in this type of environment now. You know what you're going to expect. Be ready for it in 4 or 5 weeks when it happens again. Understand the noise, understand some of the pressure. But I'm more willing to do that. And same thing with special teams. Let's not forget 2 weeks ago, it was a special teams punt return that helped break the Michigan game for us.
Yep.
So again, I don't want to just say, well, no harm, no foul and all this stuff. But, for a team that has been so mistake free and really not seeming to be flappable by any of the issues throughout the year, to have a couple of mental lapses in a game that's pretty high stakes and on the road and probably one of the tougher environments you're going to play this year, I'm willing to let it slide, hoping that they all become learning experiences that we don't see again.
Yeah. Well, look, that's absolutely right. And there's a longer tailed aspect of how you react to this game, which we'll talk about in a second. One of a couple of those I wanted to really get to about the game itself. Yeah. One, Indiana only committed 3 penalties the whole game. That's Ohio State had 8 for 58 yards. Indiana only turned the ball over once in this game, and they turned Ohio State over. So you ended up having a net 0. Indiana just couldn't get their offense going, and that to me, I do think that there's some cause for concern. And we talked about this in the pregame. It's not just this game. And it's not even that, it's like the Michigan game as well. Not even just the second half, but the fact Indiana couldn't punch the ball in at the end of the first half and had to settle for a field goal. It's the first quarter of the Michigan State game where the offense was not in good shape, didn't look like it was going to be able to do anything. They obviously resurrected themselves pretty consistently and heavily in the last 3 quarters. The offense has really not looked the same in terms of effectiveness since Curtis Rourke went down with the injury. And
I was thinking the exact same thing. Like Michigan State kind of is a bit of an outlier just based on the score, but this all seems to kind of come back to that thumb injury against Nebraska.
And it's also interesting because the receivers have just not been on target with their approaches. Like there were a couple of plays, like Miles Price had a drop on a ball that could have been a first down. Surratt, I think, had a drop. There were a couple of other players that had drops. The drops have become now an official issue with a capital I for Indiana. So much of this offense, when it was clicking, was based upon those guys making those plays. Indiana obviously only completed 8 passes in this game, which meant only 4 players caught balls. Indiana's used to having 8 players catch balls, not 8 balls caught over the course of a game. Yeah. So, we talked a lot about, we really were confident in Indiana's ability to game plan for this game, because they were going to have 2 weeks to prepare. They were going to watch a ton of film. They were going to be able to come up with cool and interesting things that were going to cause problems for Ohio State's defense. And I think that's what everybody who thought this was going to be a good game on the national level was anticipating. It's like, okay, Indiana's shown they belong and deserve to play in a game like this. Indiana's probably going to cook something up. It's going to be interesting. And that was just outside of that first drive, which was a scripted drive, that just wasn't what happened. Now, that doesn't mean Indiana can't do it against other teams. And again, I just don't know how many teams in the Big Ten would have gone into Ohio Stadium and beaten Ohio State. You do have to say, like, Nebraska went in and played a really good game against Ohio State. And I would actually argue that without the special teams miscues, this game ends up looking a lot like that game, because that game ended 21-17. And, we already talked about, like, you could either say Indiana allowed 17 offensive points or 24 offensive points, depending on how you want to count that final touchdown. And again, what lets Indiana down in this one isn't the defense, it's the offense. But that was the game Indiana ultimately needed to play. They needed to run the ball a lot more and better. It just didn't happen. I just don't know who's going into Ohio Stadium and beating Ohio State this year. I don't think Oregon could have done it. I don't think anybody else on their schedule could have done it. And this is why most teams don't go into Ohio Stadium and win. It's a very rare thing, and you have to have a really, really good performance in all three phases in order to pull it off. And it didn't happen this time. It's again, it's not, it doesn't ruin the season or anything. It's disappointing because I think most of us felt like Indiana was just going to perform better in this game than they did. But when you step back and think about it and think about the context of it and where they were playing and who they were playing against and the level of talent there, it just was a step too far for this Indiana team at this moment in time.
Yeah. And there's also just like bad sequencing of stuff. Like I think it was, Rourke had the fumble, and then I think the next set of downs was when we got the interception. But it's, it's so like you can't play like what happens if the fumble doesn't, like if you don't have the fumble and maybe that drive goes a little bit and then you're able to get the interception and do something with that, like we did the right things, just kind of, it also happened with some of our mistakes as well. And this is, this is where I do temper myself a little bit. Like we were riding high and we had very high expectations, but never in any year have I ever gone into a season thinking we're going to go win at Ohio State. Or we're going to beat Ohio State, period, let alone in the horseshoe. And there was definitely moments, even unlike Michigan, where I think one of the receivers for Ohio State was really well guarded, both front and back. And he just jumped up and just kept going up and got the ball. And it's like, all right, well, that's just an athletic play that I don't know how you stop. And you saw that multiple times, especially with their blitzing, where guys would just blitz with unbelievable speed. And it's like, I don't know how you're supposed to stop this. And by the way, I'm not sure how a lot of teams stop it. And that's why they're blitzing a lot of teams. So yeah, it's not awesome. I would have loved to have seen a little bit more poise and maybe a little bit more, I don't know how to say this the right way, but a little more fighting back, like there was that play, I think in the third quarter. And I think it was also just to not let the game get completely out of hand, but it's like 4th and 11 and we punt, which felt very Unsignetti-like. And the way the offense was kind of running, it felt a little bit like, all right, man, let's try and get out of here without getting, our ass kicked too hard. Yeah. And it just sucked to feel that because we've been there before, and it kind of goes against the ethos of this team and kind of the attitude they had. But, it is what it is. And this is the first time you're playing this level of talent on the road in a place like this. And to be expected, things didn't go right. The game started exactly the way you wanted to up until you had that 4th down stop. And then you let a couple of mistakes come in, and then Ohio State didn't have mistakes, and they, just like we have let our offense kind of lean on teams and just beat them down by scoring and scoring and scoring, it felt like Ohio State used their athleticism and just superior kind of individual talent to lean on us and put us in places where we just really felt uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, you look at how many times has Ohio State lost at home since 2016? 3.
Yeah,
3.
All right.
Now, they lost to Michigan at home in 2022. They lost to Oklahoma at home, or Oregon at home in 2021, and they lost to Oklahoma at home in 2017. That's it. And so, that's one Big Ten team out of that entire stretch, which is Michigan. Oregon was not in the Big Ten in 2021. One Big Ten team in that whole time has gone in there. So, look, you had hope Indiana was going to be able to break that streak and pull off something special. It didn't happen. So now you just got to reevaluate, what to take out of it. And again, look, I have a hard time being overly critical of the players in this circumstance. I think the coaching staff does deserve a little bit of criticism just because there didn't seem to be a plan B when plan A wasn't working. And I think that's a fair criticism, but it's also, you're trying to come up with a plan B against an Ohio State team that is very hard to have even an effective plan A against. So again, we knew that there were talent disparities. We were hoping the coaching disparity or the coaching matchup might mitigate that a little bit. Didn't happen. You pick yourself up. I do think it sets up some interesting things for next week as far as what Indiana is going to have to do. But we'll talk about that, in just a second. Anything else, I guess, from the game itself worth noting as far as you're concerned?
No, I mean, I again, we talked on it. Just want to hit it again that it's, I'm I'm starting to wonder more and more about this Rourke injury, and just, I think he's as healthy as he's going to be, but just how much effect is this putting on his ability to throw, and maybe just how much it hurts. But no, you have to mentally parse out the college football playoff implications from the game alone. And it's very hard to do. And I have a hard time doing it, even discussing it, because then you start kind of getting defensive about, well, why do we have to show that we have to do this? Get style points. And do we do enough to make it look good it's like all of that is a different conversation. It's just, this is a game. This is a season. You've had a great season. You are continuing to have a great season. Just because we can't win at Ohio State doesn't mean we haven't had a good season. And by the way, that's really never been the barometer. Right. Ever since you and I have been doing this podcast, and probably for the rest of the time we're doing this podcast, I don't really foresee a football season that we go into it where we say we have to win at Ohio State to make this season a success, no matter what else happens. And we've had years where Ohio State was on sanctions and they had a bunch of problems, right. And never, ever have, Michigan and Ohio State kind of loom in a different category. I would say even outside of Penn State, where I don't think there's a realistic world where you can be unhappy losing to those teams in their stadiums really any year. You can be annoyed and it can be a close game. It's like, damn it, we let it slip away. But you have to take a step back as an Indiana fan. And this is where I think a lot of the national media probably doesn't understand this feeling of just, this is a really a bridge. I don't say a bridge too far, but it is really a high bridge to fall. And just the idea that never, ever do we go into a year thinking we need to get this game.
Yeah. So you've got some time here as you come out of this game to reevaluate. And you've got an interesting week this week. And I think a week that is there's a lot going on this week with Indiana and with college football that I'm really fascinated to see how it plays out. The best case scenario for Indiana, if you assume that a win was off the table, which I think by the middle of the third quarter, it's like, it was like, okay, can you limit the damage? And going back to what you said with that Cignetti decision to punt, in the moment I was like, okay, I actually like this strategy because mitigation of damage has to be the answer, which I just wish they hadn't gone for the onside kick at the end, because man, I sat there and I thought when they scored that touchdown and got the 2-point conversion, I was like, wow, 31-15 doesn't look that bad. It really doesn't, especially with the way that the game went. And then, of course, they, not only do they do the onside kick that goes out of bounds, but then they let the big run in. And, of course, Ohio State, who you can't go and say Ohio State sucks and then not expect them to, score a touchdown in your face at the death. You're
although I do love the running back, sliding to not do it, and then it's like, but that's great, and then Ryan Day is going to punch it in, and Ryan Day can't even just do a handoff to the same running back to let him still get
that was a dick move on his part.
And don't be nice. You're not getting this touchdown. And by the way, I'm sitting there watching the game with a bunch of my buddies. The minute he slid, they're like, Ryan, what's he doing? Ryan Day's still punching this in. Like, Ryan Day's a dick.
Right.
And by the way, they should. I will say,
they do. No, yes.
You're playing with the big boys. You've talked some shit. You take all the lumps you have to, and I have no issue with Ryan Day punching that in. But you just have to know he's punching that in.
Well, and look, Ohio State is looking for style points, just like Indiana's looking for style points. I don't blame them for that. It's just Indiana shouldn't have given them the opportunity.
Yes, agreed.
And that was a tactical error again that I think will be a learning experience for Indiana as they make those decisions moving forward. So the polls come out, and just to keep in mind, the polls are not the College Football Playoff Committee, but Indiana drops in the in the AP poll from 5th to 10th. I don't like the fact that they dropped that far, losing at the number 2 team in the country, but it is what it is, and I'd be curious to see if they drop that far in terms of the committee rankings. I have a tendency to think perhaps that they won't drop that far. At least I would hope not, because I don't think that the loss combined with the teams that moved ahead of them necessarily warranted that. But it is where it is. Indiana, in this calculus is certainly not as safe visually as you would think that they might have been, but they are still, I think, a 98% probability according to the College Football Playoff simulator, which is essentially an algorithm that takes into account the way that the committee has ranked teams over the course of the last several years in the college football playoff process. So, Indiana didn't drop as far as some people feared. Like, there were people talking about, they might drop to 13th or 14th. They only dropped to 10th, and they do get to play again. Before we talk about the college football playoff stuff, though, we need to talk about the bucket game. I'm going to say this right now, and I don't think this is a hot take. Maybe for some people it is. I'm a little concerned about the bucket game right now. And here's why. That was an emotional game for Indiana. They had kind of built up over 2 weeks. They had a lot riding on the game. They lose that game. Now you go into Thanksgiving week, and Thanksgiving week is always kind of screwed up. You've got, obviously, Thanksgiving in the middle. You've got an empty campus. You don't have classes. So on the one hand, you can maybe do more. On the other hand, you might do less. You're going to have a Purdue team that, while they have been real bad this year, has at least a couple of times decided to play football. And it just happened this past weekend where they were down against Michigan State. They came back. They got that game to within 7. They probably should have gone down the field and tied the game if their receivers could catch anything. And they've had a couple of other games like that. At home against Northwestern, that was a 26-20 game. And, of course, the game in October against Illinois, 50-49. I'm more concerned about Indiana's mentality than I am Purdue coming in and, giving a big game performance. But it's going to be a weird atmosphere. You're not going to have students back because it's the Saturday of Thanksgiving break. So the energy is going to be different in the building. It's going to be real cold. Scott, I don't know. Have you looked at the weather forecast for this game yet?
It's going to be like 35 degrees or 32. Or
We're going to be lucky if it's that warm. Like right now, so this is going to be a night kick. I think this is the first night bucket game in all of the history of the series because Ross-Ade didn't have lights for many years. And why would you have a night bucket game? Because most of the time it's not a very good game. Right now, the night forecast for this game is 22 degrees with a wind chill of 9. This is not conditions, and I'm gonna, put the players aside. It's not conditions they're used to playing in. This is not conditions that IU fans are used to watching football games in. And so I do worry about the energy in the building. I do worry about Indiana with their confidence levels. Like, they will certainly not face the same sort of physicality that they've faced against Michigan and Ohio State against Purdue. But I do worry a little bit about, will they be able to bounce up and get the energy levels back that they had against Nebraska, that they had against Washington? So much of that felt like the crowd feeding the team. I do worry without the crowd to feed the team, what does it look like? And can IU, can Kurt Signetti, can we as podcasters and can the Twitterverse, can we get the crowd fired up and get excited about going out and standing in sub-freezing conditions for 3 hours? I hope so. I would think so, but I do think it's something to keep in mind. David Martin noting or saying here, IU will be up for Purdue game. Sig will make sure of that. I hope so. And this is where Signetti and his staff are going to have a lot of work to do this week, because it's not just the loss against Ohio State, and maybe that generates some pride in the team. It's like, we're going to really punch back, but it's so hard to take Purdue seriously. They're 1-10. They've looked awful for most of the season, but we have seen that they can occasionally score. They can occasionally make plays. Maybe I'm worried about nothing, but I just think that it's something we need to note, because Indiana has to blow out Purdue. They're either a 26 or 28 point favorite in this game. They need as many style points as they possibly can get, because that'll be the last thing that people see of them. It'll be the last thing the committee sees of them. And whether or not IU fans want to admit it, the committee is going to be looking a little bit sideways at Indiana, because, again, like I said, over the last 6 quarters, you've scored 18 points total. You need to be able to demonstrate that you can go back to the ways that you were playing before, where you were just obliterating opponents and you were leaving no doubt about who the better team was. I, in my heart, believe Indiana can do that, but I do think it's something that people should be at least cognizant of and maybe a little bit curious about how Indiana responds in this game.
I think you bring up all really good points. And, even more concerning is, as we've said a couple of times, I think right now our defense is playing the best on the best side of the ball. So I can see a situation where our offense is struggling, and maybe it's a 7-3 game or like a 14-6 game, and we're playing really well, and our defense is kind of holding Purdue to 3 points and just not a lot. They can't do much, but we have 7 or 10 points. It's like you're always, if our offense is struggling, and don't forget, for as great as our offense has been, there have been moments, we started the Maryland game with back-to-back interceptions. Did not obviously start well against Michigan State. And I wonder the psyche of this team. I have full faith the coaching staff is going to get them in the right mindset, get them in a good spot. But even in games that we played well, like Maryland again, if they come out and just throw 2 straight picks to Purdue, and then it's like, oh my God, everything you said is true. We got to have some style. You can't win this game by 2 or 3 points. Although I will say, and it's like, okay, but Penn State can. I guess Penn State's allowed to just win by 1 against. Anyway,
I know.
But let's just pretend that scenario of the Maryland game where Rourke comes out and throws an interception, and Purdue gets a touchdown, and suddenly you're down 7-0. It's like, shoot, man, we got to now we got to get 35 unanswered points because we got to win by 28. You can start getting that in your mind, and suddenly you're starting to try and blow a team out in the first quarter when you got to just really grind it and get it done. So I'm also a little bit concerned. I'm not fearing we're going to lose the game.
Right.
But I do wonder if right now where this team is at and some of the offensive struggles, if we're going to be able to blitz somebody like we have in the past, like Nebraska or like Washington. And I even worry too, this is where the eye test and some of what, unfortunately, the way it's transpired and the narrative is, even if it's a kind of like the Washington game, which I think was, like a tied game or the Maryland game, where it's a tied game at halftime, or, if we're up 21-7, it just looks like that's a, nip and tuck game. And then we end up winning by, 2 or 3 touchdowns, but they come late at the end. I wonder if that is also not good enough. It's like, we're really we got to control a really good narrative, and it would be great just to go up 28-0. And people see that, and then even if the final score is 35-14, it's like, well, they kick the shit out of them, and then then things happen at the end. Versus if it's a 14-14 game at half, and that game ends 35-14 with a win. So those are all things that are circling in my mind as well. Like you really got to come out with a good start and leave Purdue no doubt of, hey man, you guys are not going to get to blow our season up. Like this is not going to happen this year.
Yeah, it's. Again, Indiana is so demonstrably superior to Purdue. Yeah. Cignetti is going to have a point to prove. Cignetti will get them ready for the game. I just think it's something to keep an eye on. And if Indiana starts slow, I really do wonder what the energy is going to be like. The students have been so important to the energy in that building. I don't know how many there aren't going to be that many here. Like most of them left Thursday or Friday of last week to go home for Thanksgiving break. Most of them probably they scheduled their flights months ago, or they've got plans or whatever. I don't know how many of them are driving back, even the local ones, to go stand in 25-degree weather. That is going to. So I don't know what the solution is there. It's going to be fascinating to see.
Yeah.
And this is where, again, it's the long transition to being a quasi-northern college football team. There are places like Wisconsin or Penn State that kind of embrace going and standing in the cold. I don't know if Indiana's quite there yet. So we'll have to see. We'll see what happens. I think it's something to put on the radar. So let's kind of pivot a little bit now, Scott, and talk about, okay, where is Indiana at in the big scheme of things? I'm going to call up and share my screen here because I wanted to walk everybody through where Indiana's at in the FPI and how their playoff chances look. So let me get that called up for those of you that are watching live or watching on the YouTube. So you can see Indiana. I'm going to scroll down here so you can see a little bit better. So Indiana right now, 11th in FPI. They are a 97.4% chance to beat Purdue. They're a 97.7% chance to make the playoff. If you look at Indiana's individual numbers, it's interesting because Indiana's still 7th in strength of record. They are 51st now in strength of schedule, Scott. All of this worthless debate that we've had over the last 2 weeks about strength of schedule, and this shows why it's such a crappy statistic. One opponent like Ohio State, and it essentially that you lose to.
Right.
And your strength of schedule gets cut in half from what it was before. Indiana's still 7th in game control. Indiana's still 4th in average win probability. All of those metrics are still there. And I'd like to note, look at Indiana's strength of schedule now compared to some of the teams that are in the debate. Oregon's strength of schedule, 52. Texas, 36. Miami, 59. SMU, 77. Notre Dame, 78. Boise State, 81. Arizona State, 66. Even the vaunted, like, other teams that are kind of lodged up there. Penn State's only got a strength of schedule that's 19 spots better than Indiana at this point. Tennessee's is 21. They're in the same ballpark as all of these other teams in strength of schedule about all of this. And so that's really important to keep in mind, because it just highlights again how bad faith most of the arguments against Indiana have been over the course of the last couple of weeks. If you look at efficiencies, Indiana's still 8th in the country overall. Their offense, even as bad as Indiana's offense played yesterday, their offense still ranks 3rd in FPI offensive efficiency. Their defense is 25th. Special teams took a big hit, rightfully so. But this is still statistically, according to ESPN's own stats, a top 10 team in terms of how they're playing. So, when you think about that, a lot of people looked at this, this Ohio State game on the national level, and it's like, well, this is disqualifying. It's like it didn't really move the needle in terms of Indiana's overall body of work. All it did was improve their strength of schedule and give Indiana one of these vaunted quality losses that everybody else seems to have. So that is kind of how I've decided to take the game more than anything else. I think the worst thing you can do as an IU fan is get yourself in a position where you believe the narrative that somehow this game demonstrates that Indiana is not a good football team, because that's not what it did. It indicated that Indiana lost the game to Ohio State, which was always certainly a possibility. I think that's something that's worth thinking about as we move through this.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The thing that I would say, that the things that are hurting us right now is it's narrative stuff. And sometimes I do wonder if, like, you get too close into it. Like you're hitting a lot of, agree with everything you're saying. And a lot of stats, it's like, well, here's this, here's that. And like the strength of schedule stuff makes sense, but it's tough when it's like, you're 19 spots below Penn State, but it's like Penn State has a couple of, better wins, or even the Oregon beat Ohio State. The Notre Dame one is a little more interesting, but the thing that all the stats are there. The trouble is, it's not just as I'm telling you things, but I'm just saying out loud. It's not like college football playoff is just done by stats. It's not just strength of schedule versus wins and losses. We make a formula and here it goes. There are people making these decisions, and unfortunately narrative plays in. And what sucks for Indiana is, like if you do, negotiation tactics, you never want to anchor a number, which means it's the first number that gets thrown out there. Unfortunately, Indiana kind of got anchored with bad strength of schedule because it just was a bad number. Penn State has kind of the same thing going, but they played Ohio State a couple weeks ago, so their bad loss cut their strength of schedule in half, so they're not in the bad strength of schedule. So even though ours got cut in half, people still have it anchored that, like, Indiana has a bad strength of schedule. So there's that narrative. When our loss happened isn't awesome. Like, Miami already got their loss out of the way. They kind of got dropped, and they start moving up as other people are there. That's not helping us. And then, it is just that, the eye test against Ohio State. I agree with everything you said. I'm not trying to play devil's advocate totally, but I do think there's, you're playing for a college football playoff spot. You're playing for the national championship, and you're trying to show we can compete with those types of teams. And you were right on the borderline of showing you could compete. And so that's going to be effective. Those are all things I think that are going against Indiana. I will look at it this way, though, and say, I think what's helping us is I think we're at the floor. And so what I mean is that we're at 10. We'll have to see where we come in the college football playoff rankings, but I can't imagine we're any lower than 10 or 11 or 12 would still put you in. But you look at the teams that are below us. You have Boise State, which is 10-1. I don't think they're going to jump. There's no win that they're going to have that's going to jump us. Clemson is 9-2. They're not going to jump us.
Now, I don't know. Okay, I don't know if I totally agree with that. Okay. So I think it's important to kind of game out.
Okay, let's
what you're looking at with this. So if you go down the list of the playoff committee and what they've done so far, and you think about what that means in terms of everything else that's going on. So let's go down the list. So Oregon was idle this week, and they're going to stay at number 1. Ohio State beats Indiana. They're going to be number 2. Texas beats Kentucky. They're going to be number 3. Penn State wins because Minnesota never asked me to do anything for you again, Minnesota. Okay, we're done. No more relationship between me and Minnesota.
So you will not be rowing the boat?
No, I'm going to shoot a hole in the damn boat. But Penn State's going to stay at 4th. So Indiana loses. And if you think about, okay, what's the committee going to do? They're going to clearly move Notre Dame up. Notre Dame was very dominant against a frankly, an Army team that was overrated. They were overrated. They were not that good. They hadn't lost, but they weren't that good. But they're still going to move up. So that will put Notre Dame almost certainly in 5th. Alabama loses. Miami should not get that much credit for winning at home versus Wake Forest, but they will probably move up into the 6th position. Ole Miss drops down. Ole Miss was 9th. Ole Miss loses. Ole Miss is going to drop significantly. I would imagine Georgia probably moves up and gets to the 7th position. The question is going to be from the playoff committee's perspective. Playoff committee had Tennessee at 8-2 after a loss to Georgia. They had them 11th. They had them 6 spots further down than Indiana. Now, the pollsters decided they were going to move Tennessee above Indiana, which is baffling to me. But whatever. I don't think the committee is going to move Indiana below Tennessee based upon Indiana losing a game at Ohio State. If they do, I start to become a little bit concerned because that sets up a scenario where it's like, well, if they're what was it that caused them to rank Indiana that high and Tennessee 6 spots lower that would have flipped to that degree? And I don't know the answer to that. Now, the pollsters are overly reactionary. The media that vote in it are overly reactionary. I'm hoping that the committee is a little more consistent, and I'm hoping that what they've done is kind of dialed in a general idea of where they feel most of these teams are in the echelon. You go down below that, like Boise State's not going to move. They really struggled against Wyoming. SMU will come back to in a second. BYU lost. Texas A&M lost. Colorado lost. So essentially, all those teams that you're talking about, all the way down to teams 17 and 18, lost their games. 19 lost its game. 21 was where Arizona State's at. So that's kind of what I'm looking at as we go into this process. And I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I still think we have kind of a hard floor in that. I'm going to be very curious to see where we're at. Because if I like that Tennessee comp. I think it's a really good comp. I think that if we fall past 10, I'm going to be really concerned because there's just not a lot of narrative time for us to get back up. So, because we're going to have the one game against Purdue, we're going to have to look really good against that. And then we're just going to be idle. And unfortunately, I think just the way the narrative played out for Indiana wasn't awesome. Even though all of the stats you're saying are correct, I think for most people, it's like they played a weak strength of schedule, and when they had a chance to show us they could do something, they didn't.
Right.
As much as some of that is unfair, I also think some of that is slightly legitimate, and it just is the narrative, and you're not going to change it because, again, like you're saying, Miami's kind of like everyone's forgotten about Miami's loss. Like it still counts, it's still in the schedule, but there's just when things happen matter. And unfortunately, the order of operations hasn't been awesome for Indiana in this. And, you're fighting a real battle of this kind of, we don't want non-blue bloods breaking into the blue blood party. And it does feel like that is real. And it does feel like there's a world where, Indiana could be left out. And if you're going to do it, now's the time to rank them low enough. Because if you put them at 8, 9, or 10, I feel really comfortable. Because I don't think there's going to be 3 teams that are jumping us with us getting to 11-1. But if you put us right on the bubble or outside the bubble now, I think there's a world where it's just tough for us to get back into it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on what they're going to do with some of these teams. I don't think anybody knows, because you just got, at some point, you got to think that the committee has backed themselves into a corner from a logic perspective with some of the teams that they've decided to rank and how they've decided to approach them. So to go back to something that you mentioned Clemson. So the one concern that you have with Clemson and South Carolina is that they play each other in the last game of the season. Now, Clemson currently is 17th in the CFP. South Carolina is 18th. One of those teams will get eliminated, essentially. Either Clemson will have 3 losses out of the ACC, or South Carolina will have 4 losses.
Right. Now, how much stock do you put in the win, I guess, is you're saying?
I fundamentally do not understand the effing obsession with South Carolina. Here's who South Carolina has beaten so far, Scott. They've beaten Old Dominion, Kentucky, LSU, which is not, they lost to LSU. They lost to LSU at home. They beat Akron. They lost to Mississippi. They lost to Alabama, close game, still lost. They won at Oklahoma. They beat Texas A&M, which doesn't look that great right now.
Right.
They lost at they won at Vanderbilt. They won against Missouri, how they're ranked is still beyond me, and they beat Wofford. Those are their wins. It's like, that is the people arguing that they should be a CFP contender with that record.
And 3 losses.
And 3 losses isn't, even if they beat Clemson, that's insane. Clemson, for their part, they lost to Georgia 34-3. They lost to Louisville 33-21. Unranked Louisville, by the way.
It was a Georgia game that was at Clemson too.
No, it was a neutral site game. It was in Atlanta.
Okay, sorry. All right.
But the rest of Clemson's wins. Here's the rest of Clemson's wins: Appalachian State, North Carolina State, Stanford, Florida State, Wake Forest, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Pitt, whose Pitt's completely lost the plot, and then they just beat the Citadel. What's the argument? Even if you beat South Carolina is a team that would have 4 losses at that point. What's the argument? These are the things that I'm hoping that the committee is more clear-headed on than the polls have been, in terms of how reactionary they are to stuff that's happening in the minute. Like, I think the thing that's most fascinating to me is that the AP poll decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to rank Miami and SMU ahead of Indiana after Indiana lost at the number 2 team in the country. Here's SMU's wins, Scott. Nevada, Houston Christian, TCU, Florida State, Louisville, Stanford, Duke, Pitt, Boston College, and Virginia. There's not a ranked team in that mix. That is an incredibly mid ACC. Go to Miami. Who has Miami beaten so far on the season? Their wins are Florida, who's back now. That win looks better. That was a very bad Florida team at the beginning of the year. Florida A&M, Ball State, South Florida, Virginia Tech, barely. Cal, barely. Louisville, barely. Florida State, Duke, and Wake Forest. There's no meat on that bone. So I'm hoping that what the committee ends up doing is perhaps the committee decides, all right, we're going to reward Miami for reasons that only have to do with their brand name and move them ahead of Indiana. But we're going to keep SMU down a little bit lower, because what has SMU really done over the course of the season that's any different than what Indiana's done? And Indiana's only losses to the number 2 team in the country on their field, on the road. So that to me becomes the big question.
And I agree with all that. The slight counterpoint would be, as you're saying all of this, you could look at, again, like being, see the forest from the trees. It's I'm just taking a step back. I'm not sure I totally even agree with this, but the idea, it's like, all right, Miami's played a soft schedule. Indiana's played a soft schedule. They both have 1 loss. And again, but like the narrative kind of became, all right, Indiana, show us you're willing to compete at this level. And you just didn't do it. I agree. I don't think that's a fair argument. I don't think that's a fair, standard to judge Indiana on, but I do see that narrative. I do see where that narrative is like, let's just take a step back and stop parsing, Akron versus Southern Illinois wins, and just, you're both soft schedules. You're both 10-1. You both have losses. The trouble is Indiana kind of had this, the way things were set up for them, not because of the way they wanted it to, just narrative wise, was like, all right, man, here's a showcase. Show us that you can compete. And you were right on the borderline of being in that, of that competing level.
I'm with you on that. I guess what I'm saying though is the committee is not the pollsters.
Yes.
And so everything you're saying about narrative is correct. But I do wonder for whatever we want to say about the process, the fact of the matter is the committee decided Indiana was pretty high in the pecking order over the course of this last stretch. The last ranking, the College Football Playoff Committee ranked Indiana 5th, taking everything into account. They ranked them 5th, and they ranked Miami 8th after a loss. They ranked SMU 13th after a loss. I don't know what the justification would be with all the power numbers, with everything else, for them to move Indiana below both Miami and SMU. I'm really curious to see how they decide to handle that.
Let me ask you this.
Go on.
When the rankings come out on Tuesday, let me flip this around on you. What ranking would you be? Obviously, like fifth would be awesome. Like, what ranking would you say I'm very comfortable that Indiana is in a good, assuming we're going to beat Penn State, assuming we're going to beat Purdue at a good number, so that, take that out of the equation. What ranking are you like, I'm comfortable that we're going to be good to finish this off with a win against Purdue? And what ranking are you like, oh God, I feel like we could be in a real danger of not making it? Like, what are those numbers for you?
So I've been trying to do the accounting here.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm anticipating the committee may end up doing. And there's a couple of switch offs here that may change things. I think if Indiana is 11th or 12th in this ranking, they're in real trouble. I anticipate Indiana is going to be 8th in the ranking, but I could see them being as high as 6th, or I could see them, somewhere between 6th and 9th. So if I look at it right now, I'm guessing the committee is going to go as follows. They're going to go Oregon 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3, Penn State 4, Notre Dame 5, Miami 6, Georgia 7, Indiana 8, Tennessee 9, Boise State 10, SMU 11, Clemson 12, Alabama 13, South Carolina 14, and Arizona State 15. So with that becomes very interesting, because then you would have Clemson 12th in the ranking, but not in the playoff, because Arizona State would be the 5th team, the 5th conference champion. They would be the 12 seed, but they would be ranked 15th. And then at that point, it's like, well, if Clemson wins, that's the one scenario I get concerned about. Could the ACC get 3 teams in the playoff? What you're going to end up with almost certainly is, and then this is where the remaining games matter. Okay. So you're going to end up in that last week. Texas has got to play Texas A&M. Whoever wins that game goes to the college football, or goes to the SEC championship game to play Georgia, who clinched a spot yesterday. So all the tiebreakers are done. It is just Texas or Texas A&M going into that game. Now, I said yesterday on Twitter, hey, thanks for playing A&M. Do us a favor and knock off Texas. Here's why I said that. The best way to get rid of Texas A&M out of this equation, even though they're largely gone already, but also damage Texas enough where you look at their schedule and say, wow, this is really weak, would be for A&M to beat Texas, deny them the chance to go to the SEC championship game, and then have Georgia boat race Texas A&M, which would get them out of the rankings entirely, would move Georgia up probably to number 3.
Down maybe under us.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, I think Texas is going to make it regardless, but I'd like to just, I'm a big fan of like just trying to knock teams out as we get into things as much as possible. Penn State is going to beat Maryland. Maryland, you want to talk about a worthless program right now. I mean, it's like, could you do something to help Indiana's strength of schedule? You have Iowa at home. Iowa can't score. You let them win. They score 29 points in that game. Like what? Right,
Minnesota beating Penn State, which was very possible. Like that would have been so helpful.
Yep.
So helpful.
Yep. But when you go then down the list, there's some games that really are going to matter and be interesting. Notre Dame's got to go to LA and play USC. USC just clinched, I think, bowl eligibility yesterday. They come back and they beat UCLA. I am not particularly sure that USC's got the juice to beat Notre Dame, but that would be nice.
Notre Dame's out.
No, or Notre Dame drops below Indiana permanently. Miami obviously is going to play SMU. One of those teams is guaranteed another loss in the ACC title game. And I don't know that either team can necessarily sustain a second loss in the ACC title game and maintain being in the playoff. Tennessee's got to go to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt has not looked great lately, but Vanderbilt is going to look at that and say, we beat Alabama this year. If we could knock off Tennessee, this becomes one of the best seasons in program history. And Tennessee, as we know, is flawed. Though they're a really good defensive team, an average offensive team, and they got to go to Nashville to play that game. You want Vanderbilt to win that game if you're Indiana. Boise State, I don't know that it necessarily matters that much, because at this stage, unless they fall apart, they are going to be the 4 seed because they are going to be the next highest conference champion. We already talked about SMU. They've got to play in the ACC title game. So the other lingering question becomes Clemson versus South Carolina. I have a hard time actually seeing the committee saying, yeah, we're going to put South Carolina in the playoff. I could see the committee saying, gosh, we might want to put Clemson in the playoff, but I have a feeling that they would put Clemson in the playoff ahead of whoever lost in the ACC title game, because I have a real hard time with, saying, look at their schedules. Let's put 3 ACC teams. So, and then of course you go down the list. Alabama's pretty much done. An Auburn win isn't going to help them. We already talked about South Carolina, and then whatever the hell happens in the Big 12 at this point, you've got Colorado, who loses to Kansas. They're done. You've got Arizona State. You've got Iowa State. I don't know what the Big 12 tiebreakers are. I haven't had a chance to take a look at it, but it
sounds like fun bedtime reading.
Whoever's going to come out of that is they're not going to have that quality of a win in the Big 12 title game. And so I have a hard time seeing them even popping into the top 12. They'll still get in because they're guaranteed as the 5th conference champion to get in. So essentially, Indiana has to be in the top 11 if they're going to be in the college football playoff. So I think they're fine. I think as long as they go out and beat Purdue handily and leave no doubt and look good, that's the ticket. That's the secret to things. And so that's why this game and this week is so important.
So you're saying like under if they're 10, 11 or 12, you're concerned. Above that, you're fine.
Yes, I think if they're 10, I have a hard time seeing a scenario where they would be in trouble on that front, but we'll have to see.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that. I still feel comfortable. I'm going to be better on Tuesday night. The 10th ranking is nerve wracking. 8 would be great. Cause then, there's a world where, depending on what happens, you might still have a shot at a home game. If you go down into that 9, 10, 11 range, you're probably not going to have a home game, and you're risking playing a game at Penn State or having another game against Ohio State, depending on how the Big Ten championship goes. I was thinking about this earlier. You had mentioned in one of your preview pods, kind of the thing that I've talked about too, is like, this is, you only get to go up the mountain once. Like, this is such a fun season because you're doing it once. And the idea behind, the Watford shot season, I think 11-12 basketball season versus the 12-13 was actual expectations. And I agree with all that. And again, this college football playoff stuff is wild to be talking about and kind of crazy. But I go back to that Watford shot season, and I've said this for years. That IU team going into March was playing so well and playing so fantastic. They ran into the wrong team. They played Kentucky, who won it all that year in the Sweet 16. And I would still say played Kentucky probably the toughest game in their run. It was like 102-92 or 104-90 or something. It was a wild game. Again, I wasn't going into that season expecting to win a title or go to a Final Four, but it's looking back, it's like, well, that was our best shot. Like in the last 15 years, that season, let's just say we're not in Kentucky's bracket. I think that team makes a Final Four. That was our best shot in the last 15 years. And there's a world where obviously was not going into this year ready to win a national championship or be in the college football playoff or go to the semifinals. But it's very possible, like, all right, but you're here. And this is a real chance. Now, do it against Purdue. Everything else you have to leave up to the committee. But I do believe for Indiana to have a real chance to make a run in this college football playoff, I felt for a while that the bracket needs to break correctly. And I really think they need to have a home game in the first round. I think those are really key things to make it something where if Indiana's going to have a chance to make a run, I think those things need to line up. And so I'm with you. And I think to get a home game, you probably got to drop no lower than 8th or 9th in the next rankings, and then for some things to work out for you.
Yeah, and it's going to be a real touch and go on that. And this is where I think if Indiana wants to host, they've really got to go out and lay it on Purdue. They got to demonstrate that they're able to do that, because that could be the deciding factor. So, look, we're going to learn a lot more on Tuesday, and we'll kind of see how things go with all of it. But it's going to be fascinating to kind of see how it plays out. And I'm I think Indiana we'll just have to see.
Yeah.
Based upon what the committee's done up to this point, I'm hopeful that they don't do what they did with Miami and knock them way the hell down. But we'll have to see. I really don't know what they're taking into account at this point or how they're going to factor in how Indiana played in that game against the totality of what they've done overall.
When you wonder, too, like, did they knock Miami down knowing Miami's going to have some time to build it back up? Because if you knock Indiana down, you know that they don't have time or the schedule to bring it back up. So basically, the committee's kind of sealing Indiana's fate this Tuesday.
Yeah.
It feels like.
That to some degree. I think so. All right, Scott. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Any final thoughts from you before we get going?
No, I mean, real quick, give us your take on what the experience at Ohio Stadium was like being an IU fan.
It was good. I mean, I actually was in an area that was that I didn't have bad fans around me. Like, nobody treated me poorly. I will say, kind of had the worst for the men's bathrooms. It was the longest lines I think I've ever been in for stadiums. I don't know what the heck was going on there. That was ridiculous for a stadium that's got 100 and some thousand seats.
Right.
But it was fine. I mean, that stadium's an interesting stadium. It's certainly loud, but it wasn't like overwhelmingly, deafeningly loud. But it was certainly a trouble for Indiana players in the game, and that's, I think, an interesting thing to think about. I am. The tailgate scene before and the overall scene before was not nearly as fun as Indiana's, which I think is normal to think about because Ohio State's just kind of in a different plane of existence when it comes to this stuff. They are oriented in a whole lot of, they're oriented towards winning titles. Indiana has had to kind of create the tailgate scene around it as a way to keep fans fun and excited or feeling fun and excited. But it was good. Other IU fans did not have similarly positive experiences with the fans, but I thought the overall setup was fine. It's just, to me, I've been to a lot of other college football environments. The Ohio State one's weird. Like, their fans clearly love it and love the way that it's done, and good for them. I don't find it to be that exciting of an environment, but I'm not an Ohio State fan. If I was an Ohio State fan, I'd probably really be in love with that entire setup. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But overall, the trip was good. We had a good time. Saw a lot of IU people there. A lot of IU people who were engaged and excited. And it was fun to see so many IU fans in the stands. I just wish that they'd had a better game to react to.
Yeah. All right.
So anyway, thanks to all you folks for tuning in. Appreciate you joining us here on the show. And we'll be back on Tuesday. Bison Chat. We'll be talking about the college football playoff reveal, and we'll see how things go with that. And obviously, we'll have a lot to talk about there. We'll recap Curt Cignetti's press availability, and we'll talk through what Indiana needs to do to put themselves in position to beat up on Purdue, hopefully, this Saturday. That'll wrap it up for us. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We will, again, be back later on in the week with more content for you as we wrap up this season. Indiana 10-1, and with a chance to go to 11-1 and extend the best season in school history. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody. Thanks, folks. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everybody.